There is a kind of town that keeps its secrets badly, where everyone knows everything and speaks of nothing, where the surface is polished smooth and the scandals run just underneath it. New Brunswick, New Jersey in 1922 was exactly that kind of town. It was a small city of about 30,000 people. It had a prosperous centre. It had its prominent families. It had its churches, and it had its whispers. The whispers in this case were about a man of God and the woman who sang in his choir. Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall was 41 years old. He was the rector of St. John, the Evangelist Episcopal Church on George Street, one of the most respectable addresses in town. He was handsome. He was charming. He was well-read and well-liked. He had married Frances Noel Stevens in 1911. Frances was 7 years his senior. She was from one of the most prominent families in New Brunswick, with connections to wealth and property throughout the county. The marriage appeared to be what it was supposed to be: solid, respectable, appropriate. But for several years before 1922, members of St. John's congregation had noticed something. Something in the way the Reverend looked at a particular woman in the choir. Something in the way she looked back. Eleanor Reinhardt Mills was 34 years old. She was vivacious, romantic, and openly affectionate in a way that did not quite fit into the buttoned-up world she inhabited. She had married James Mills when she was 17 years old. James was older than her. He was a decent, hard-working man of limited ambition. He served as the sexton and janitor at St. John's, the same church where his wife sang soprano in the choir. They lived 5 blocks from the Hall household in a ramshackle house on Carmen Street. They had 2 children, Charlotte, who was 16 in 1922, and Daniel, who was 12. James Mills worked hard and provided what he could and seemed largely oblivious, or chose to appear so, to what was happening between his wife and their rector. He once told a reporter that Reverend Hall was too good a friend of mine, implying that nothing improper could possibly be taking place between such an upstanding man and his wife. He later admitted, quietly, that he had known about the affair for years and had chosen to say nothing. Eleanor's affair with Edward Hall had been going on for at least 4 years by the time of the murders. It was an open secret in the congregation. Hall had even paid for major surgery for Eleanor when James could not afford it. He had paid for it out of his own pocket. Nobody directly questioned this. In New Brunswick in the early 1920s, you did not directly question the rector of an Episcopal church. Not out loud. Not if you valued your place in the community. But privately, in parlours and on street corners and over garden fences, people talked. And on the other side of town, in the grand 3-story house on Nickel Avenue, Frances Hall knew. She had known for years, and she had said very little. Not because she did not feel it, but because she was Frances Stevens Hall, and Frances Stevens Hall did not make scenes. On the evening of Thursday, the 14th of September 1922, Reverend Hall received a telephone call at home. The call was from Eleanor Mills. She wanted to meet him. He left the house. Eleanor had already been seen that evening by multiple witnesses, including the motorman of the trolley she boarded on her way out toward De Russey's Lane. She was the last passenger off. She was carrying a small parcel. She walked in the direction of an abandoned farm on the edge of town, a place known locally as a lover's lane. The spot had a crab apple tree. It was secluded. It was a place where people went when they did not want to be found. Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills were never seen alive again after that evening. At the Hall household, the night watchman of the nearby New Jersey State College for Women later reported that the lights in the Hall residence were on throughout the night. At 2:30 in the morning, he saw a woman enter the house. Who she was, he could not say. On the morning of Saturday, the 16th of September, a young working-class couple named Pearl and Raymond Balmer were walking near the abandoned De Russey farm. Pearl was 15 years old. They were cutting across the property, and then they stopped. There, beneath a crab apple tree, lying on their backs side by side, were 2 bodies, a man and a woman. They were neatly dressed. They appeared almost composed. as though they had been arranged. The man's right arm had been positioned so that his hand rested against the woman's neck. Her hand lay across his thigh. His Panama hat had been placed over his face, concealing the gunshot wound to his head. His calling card had been propped carefully against the sole of his left shoe. The name on the card printed in Gothic lettering, Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, Rector, St. John's Episcopal Church, New Brunswick, New Jersey, and scattered all around the two bodies, strewn across the grass like a deliberate statement, were letters. Love letters. Dozens of them, written in a woman's hand, addressed to the Reverend. Passionate, intimate, unmistakable. The woman lying beside him had been shot 3 times in the head. Her throat had been slashed with such violence that her head was nearly severed from her body. And, though this detail would not be discovered until a second autopsy 4 years later, her tongue and vocal cords had been cut out and removed. The man had been shot once, cleanly, in the head. 1 bullet for the rector, 3 for the woman who sang for him, and her voice removed entirely. The arrangement said something. It was not random. It was not the scene of a robbery or a panicked attack. It was theatre, designed by someone who wanted the world to see exactly what this had been, and who had wanted, very specifically, to silence one of the 2 people lying there. What happened next was a catastrophe of a different kind. The first officers on the scene did not secure the area. Word spread through New Brunswick with the speed that small towns manage when something truly extraordinary happens, and within hours, hundreds of people had descended on the D. Rossi farm. They walked through the scene. They picked up the letters. They passed around the calling card. They carried off pieces of the crabapple tree as souvenirs. By the weekend, vendors had set up refreshment stands at the edge of the property. Local police were directing traffic. The crime scene was, in any forensically meaningful sense, destroyed. This single failure, the inability or unwillingness to cordon off and preserve the evidence, would haunt every subsequent attempt to prosecute this case. The investigation was led by Somerset County officials, since the farm technically sat on the Somerset side of the county line, rather than by the New Brunswick police who had initially responded. The jurisdictional confusion added further disorder. The autopsies were conducted. They established the cause of death clearly enough. Gunshots by a .32 caliber pistol. Edward Hall shot once. Eleanor Mills shot 3 times. The precise details of the throat wound were noted, but the removal of the tongue and vocal cords was missed entirely. That particular detail would not come to light until 1926. The investigation sputtered. Witnesses were interviewed by the hundreds. Theories were floated and abandoned. The county prosecutor brought the case before a grand jury. The grand jury declined to indict. No arrests were made, and the case went cold, or rather it went to the newspapers, which is a different thing entirely. From the beginning, suspicion clustered around one family. Frances Hall, her brother Henry Hugel Stevens, her brother William Carpenter Stevens, known to everyone in New Brunswick as Willie, and a cousin, Henry de la Bruyere Carpenter. The theory, as the investigators understood it, was this. Frances Hall had discovered, finally and irreversibly, that her husband intended to leave her. There is evidence for this. A minister named Paul Hamborski came forward later to say that Reverend Hall had told him, approximately 1 month before the murders, that his wife had grown cold and was a different woman. Hall told Hamborski he was very much afraid that she will do me bodily harm. He said he had no intention of ending the affair. He said he and Eleanor would probably run off together soon. If Frances Hall knew or suspected that her husband was about to elope with Eleanor Mills, the motive was devastating. Not simply the humiliation of a cheating husband, the total collapse of her world. Her social standing, her identity, everything she was in New Brunswick was built on being Mrs. Reverend Hall of Nickel Avenue, and it was about to be taken from her. Her brother Henry was the more conventionally capable of the 2 brothers. He was a retired exhibition marksman. He was the kind of man who could shoot. Henry Stevens claimed he had been at his home on the Jersey Shore that evening, bluefishing. He had witnesses, but other witnesses placed him in New Brunswick that same day. And then there was Willie. William Carpenter Stevens was, by any accounting, one of the more extraordinary figures in this entire story. He was in his early 50s at the time of the murders. He lived in the Hall household with his sister Frances and her husband. He was incapable of holding down a job. He spent much of his time at a local firehouse where the firefighters tolerated his presence with affection. He collected butterflies. He wandered. He spoke in ways that sometimes confused and sometimes charmed the people around him. New Brunswick called him Nutty Willie. Historians looking back now describe his behaviour as consistent with what we would today call high-functioning autism, though the condition had not yet been clinically described in 1922 and no definitive diagnosis can be made. What is certain is that Willie was deeply devoted to his sister. He had every reason in terms of loyalty to Frances to be involved in whatever happened that night. He was also, according to a maid in the household, wandering the Hall residence on the morning after the murders, asking strange questions. He asked whether the Reverend had come home the night before. He seemed, the maid said, almost giddy, and one detail, small but persistent, clung to Willie Stevens throughout the entire case: the calling card. The Reverend's business card propped theatrically against his shoe. A fingerprint expert testified in 1926 that the smudge on that card matched Willie's thumbprint. The defence brought in 3 other fingerprint experts who found no such resemblance. The card had been handled by police, by reporters, by dozens of curious onlookers. It had sat in the possession of a newspaper editor for 3 years. The question of whose print was on it was never definitively settled. But the image of Willie Stevens carefully propping that card against his dead brother-in-law's foot was one that the prosecution could not resist painting for the jury. Whether he did it or not is something we still do not know. Among the hundreds of people interviewed in the initial investigation, one stood out above all others. Her name was Jane Gibson. She was approximately 50 years old. She lived on a property adjacent to the D. Russey farm in a converted barn. She raised Poland China hogs. The press dubbed her the Pig Woman. She said she had been awake on the night of September 14th. She had heard her corn being stolen. She had mounted her mule. She had ridden out into the darkness to investigate, and she had seen things. 2 men and 2 women, silhouetted in the dark at the edge of the Crabapple orchard. A quarrel. A woman's voice shouting, "Explain those letters." Then screams. Then shots. Then silence. She said she had seen Francis Hall's face in the moonlight. She said she had heard the name Henry called out. It was a dramatic account. It was also an account that changed in various details every time Jane Gibson told it. In statements to police, in interviews with reporters, and later in court testimony, the story shifted. The number of people she saw varied. The precise sequence of events varied. The details of what she heard and when she heard it varied. The press, of course, did not let any of this stop them. The Pig Woman was wonderful copy. The Pig Woman was what the story needed. A mule-riding eyewitness who had watched the whole thing from the darkness. Whether or not she was telling the truth was almost beside the point, as far as the newspapers were concerned. She was selling papers, and in 1922 that was what mattered most. For 4 years the Hall Mills case simmered. The grand jury had declined to indict. No one had been charged. The investigation was effectively dormant, but the story was not forgotten. It never quite went away in the press or in the collective imagination of a reading public that had found it irresistible. And then, in 1924, William Randolph Hearst bought a failing New York tabloid called the Daily Mirror. He bought it specifically to compete with the Daily News. He needed readers. He needed sensation. He needed a story that would make people buy his newspaper every single morning. He found the Hall Mills case. In July of 1926, the Daily Mirror's front page screamed, "Hall Mills Murder Mystery Bared." The headlines that followed across the subsequent week escalated the drama relentlessly. The Mirror had obtained testimony from the estranged husband of a maid who had worked in the Hall household. The husband claimed his wife had told him that she knew on the night of the murders that the Reverend Hall intended to elope with Eleanor Mills. He claimed his wife had been paid $5,000 to keep quiet about what she knew of Mrs. Hall's movements that night. Was it true? Was the maid's husband reliable? Was the maid herself reliable? None of that mattered as much as the fact that the Mirror was printing it, and that people were buying the Mirror in extraordinary numbers. Circulation jumped. The New Jersey governor felt the pressure. The case was reopened. Francis Hall, Willie Stevens, Henry Stevens, and their cousin Henry Carpenter were arrested in the summer and autumn of 1926. The trial of the century, as the tabloids predictably announced, was about to begin. The trial opened on the 3rd of November 1926 at the Somerset County Courthouse in Somerville, New Jersey. What followed was, by any measure, a spectacle. 300 reporters packed the courthouse and the surrounding streets. 60 leased telegraph wires ran out of the building to transmit the daily dispatches. A 129-position telephone switchboard, the same one that had been used for the Dempsey-Tunney prize fight, was installed to handle the volume of calls. The streets outside the courthouse filled with souvenir and refreshment stands, exactly as they had filled 4 years earlier at the crime scene. The trial had become a country fair. It had also become something more significant than a country fair, because the reporters who covered it were not ordinary reporters. H.L. Mencken was there. Mary Roberts Reinhardt, the famous mystery novelist, was there. Billy Sunday, the evangelist, was there. Everyone wanted a piece of this story. The prosecution was led by Alexander Simpson, a state senator who had been appointed special prosecutor. The defense was led by Robert McCarter, a former New Jersey Attorney General. This was not going to be a local proceeding. This was a national event. The prosecution's theory was that Frances Hall had discovered her husband's plan to elope with Eleanor Mills, that she had enlisted her brother Henry, the exhibition marksman, to fire the shots, that Willie had been present, that the scene had been staged to send a message. The evidence offered was, in its strongest form, 3 things. Willie's alleged fingerprint on the calling card, Henry's possession of a .32 caliber pistol, the same caliber used in the murders. Frances Hall sat through the trial with an expression that gave nothing away. The press called her the Iron Widow. She was pale. She was composed. She showed no emotion. She answered questions directly and briefly. She denied everything. She had not left her house that night. She had not arranged anything. She had not known her husband was in danger. She was a woman whose husband had been murdered, she implied, and who was now being subjected to additional suffering by a prosecution that had no real case. The defense pointed out that Frances's own aversion to publicity throughout the entire proceeding spoke against guilt. Because if you had murdered your husband for having an affair, the last thing you would want was for the whole country to know he had been having one. The public reading of Hall and Eleanor's love letters in open court, a recurring feature of the trial proceedings that filled pages of every newspaper in America, made the Reverend's double life entirely visible. Frances Hall had spent years preserving the appearance of a respectable marriage. A murder trial was the worst possible mechanism for doing that. Henry Stevens, for his part, said prove it. He had an alibi for the sure. His witnesses backed him up. 3 fingerprint experts said the print on the calling card was not Willie's. And then the pig woman was brought in. She could not walk. She was dying of cancer. She was carried into the courtroom on a stretcher by an ambulance crew, attended by a doctor and 2 nurses. The iron hospital bed was positioned so that she faced the jury directly. She was wheeled past the defendants on her way in. The courtroom was absolutely silent. And then she told her story. The darkness, the quarrel, the voices, the screams, the shots, the name Henry. She was compelling. She was dramatic. She was the prosecution's entire case, essentially. And while she testified from her hospital bed, her elderly mother sat in the front row of the public gallery, wringing her hands and muttering audibly to anyone seated near enough to hear, "She's a liar! She's a liar! She's a liar!" The jury deliberated and acquitted all three defendants: Francis Hall, Henry Stevens, Willie Stevens, not guilty, all three. The cousin, Henry Carpenter, who had been tried separately, was also acquitted. The prosecution's case had been built almost entirely on the testimony of a woman whose story had changed repeatedly, whose own mother was publicly calling her a liar, and whose credibility the defense had comprehensively destroyed. The fingerprint evidence was contradicted by multiple experts. Henry's alibi had witnesses. Francis's stoic demeanour in court, rather than suggesting cold-blooded calculation, had come across to the jury as the dignity of a wrongly accused woman. And Willie had not been the liability the prosecution hoped for. He was coherent. He was sometimes unexpectedly sharp. At one point, when the special prosecutor asked whether it was not rather fishy to go out searching for a missing man in the middle of the night, Willie responded with a calmness and a logic that deflated the question entirely. The jury was out for hours. Then they came back. Not guilty. The defendants walked free. The reporters filed their final dispatches. The refreshment stands were packed away. The circus left town. And the bodies of Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills remained in their graves unavenged, their murders unsolved. Let us go back to the crabapple tree for a moment, because the staging of that scene is the most legible thing in the entire case. It was not random. It was not panicked. Two people had been shot, and their bodies arranged side by side, intimately, with the man's arm under the woman's neck. His calling card, with his name in Gothic letters, propped against his foot. Her love letters scattered around them. Her throat cut so deeply her head was nearly severed. Her tongue removed, the hat placed over his face, but her wounds left open. This arrangement communicates something clearly. Whoever did this was making a statement. The calling card said, "This is who he was." The letters said, "This is what he was doing." Her open wounds and removed tongue said, "This is what we think of what she was doing." The covered face of the rector said, perhaps somewhere there was some residual regard for the man, if not for the woman. This is not the work of a stranger. This is not a robbery. This is not a random act. This is personal, deeply, specifically, furiously personal. Someone was broadcasting their motive in the staging of those bodies. They hated Eleanor Mills in a way they did not quite hate Edward Hall. They were angry at the woman who had seduced a married man, or who had been seduced by him, and they chose to make that anger visible. The throat, the tongue, the voice removed. Her voice had been used to write those letters scattered around her. Her voice had been used to speak to the man lying beside her. Her voice was the thing that had destroyed something, and her voice was what was taken. That specificity has convinced most serious analysts of the case, then and now, that the Stevens family was responsible. Because who else would have felt that particular fury? That particular need to silence? That particular theatrical impulse to leave a message? Only someone who had been humiliated. Only someone who had watched their world being taken by the woman whose letters were now blowing in the autumn wind of a New Jersey lover's lane. The Hall Mills case did not simply disappear after the acquittal, it had entered the culture. The courtroom had attracted writers who went home and wrote from what they had seen. Frances Noyes Hart, a journalist who covered the trial, wrote a novel called The Bellamy Trial in 1927. It is widely credited as one of the foundational works of the courtroom mystery genre. It was turned into a film in 1929. The silent film, The Goose Woman, released in 1925 while the case was still unresolved, starred Louise Dresser in a role clearly based on Jane Gibson. William Kunstler, who would go on to become one of the most famous civil liberties lawyers in America, published a book on the case in 1964. He re-released it with updated material in 1980. And in 2013, a scholar named Sarah Churchwell published a book about F. Scott Fitzgerald and the Great Gatsby. In it, she makes a compelling case that Fitzgerald, who was working on the Great Gatsby at the time of the Hall Mills murders and trial, drew on the case when he wrote the deaths at the end of his novel. 2 people shot in a lover's lane, their scandal exposed. The wealthy and well-connected escaping consequences, while the bodies of ordinary people lie unclaimed. If Churchwell is right and the argument is persuasive, then the Hall Mills murders left their fingerprint on the most celebrated American novel of the 20th century. The case has also been examined as the originating moment of American tabloid journalism. The screaming headlines, the personal details, the eyewitness drama, the court as theatre, became the template for tabloid coverage of every major crime case that followed. Edward Wheeler Hall was buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, where he had grown up. Eleanor Mills was buried in Van Leuve Cemetery in North Brunswick. She was 34 years old. She left behind a husband who had known about the affair and said nothing. She left behind 2 teenage children. She left behind letters that the entire country eventually read. And she left behind a murder that was never officially solved. Frances Stevens Hall died in 1942, buried alongside her husband in Greenwood Cemetery. Willie Stevens died the same year. Henry Stevens had died in 1939. None of them were ever convicted of anything. Jane Gibson, the pig woman, died in 1930, not long after the trial. Her mother, the woman who called her a liar from the gallery, outlived her. The crabapple tree was eventually cut down. People had been carrying pieces of it away since the weekend the bodies were found. By the time the trial ended, there was not much of it left. The De Russie farm was swallowed eventually by suburban development. The Lover's Lane became a road. The road became a suburb. The suburb has no memory of what happened there. What remains is the question. A question that, after a century, is no closer to a definitive answer. Who killed the minister and the choir singer? Who arranged them with such deliberate intimacy under the crab-apple tree? Who scattered her letters? Who placed his card? Who cut out her tongue? The evidence points, as it has always pointed, toward the Stevens family. Most serious analysts of the case believe Frances Hall ordered it. Henry carried it out, and Willie was there. But belief is not proof, and proof is what the jury never had. So the question stays open, under a tree that is no longer there, on a lane that no longer exists, in a town that has spent 100 years trying to move on. You've been listening to the audio podcast, The Hall Mills Murder Case, a scandal that gripped a nation, a mystery tangled in secrets, rumour and betrayal, and a case that even after all these years refuses to rest quietly in the past. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's most sensational unsolved crimes. If you found this episode compelling, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share history's mysterious minds with fellow lovers of true crime and forgotten history. Your support helps us continue uncovering the stories that still whisper from the shadows. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the past.